Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Modern forensics have vastly changed the way a crime scene is viewed since crimes first were attempted to be solved. Convicting someone on pure speculation or circumstantial evidence was common in the days before scientific methods could be used. Now, there mustn't be a shadow of a doubt. Long ago, being at the wrong place at the wrong time could lead you to the gallows. And that's the sort of story we're going to look at today. This complicated tale includes many factors: timing, unreliable witnesses, race, and a killer who may not have been a killer. This is the story of John Ten Eyck. Fat tufts of snow tumbled in chaotic spirals from the sky as a young John Carey Jr. made his way along the road. It was the 29th of November in the year 1877, and he was 15. The time was 5 p.m. when his path crossed that of John Ten Eyck. Ten Eyck asked Carey Jr. if the Stillmans who lived nearby were selling butter that evening, and if they had any company over. Carey had just been there, and said that indeed they had butter to sell, but that he did not know if anyone had arrived at their home since he left. The Stillmans, Sarah and David, were an elderly couple. David was 80 and Sarah was 67. They made a little extra money selling their homemade butter and other farm goods from their own kitchen. An old map of Sheffield shows a Stillman farm on Broadman Street. The farm had made the couple a comfortable living for a long time, but they were too old to run it on their own now, and so had hired help. John Carey Jr. was that help. The next morning, John Carey Jr. was back at the Stillman's farm. He went right to work in the barn. After milking the cows, he headed with the pails into the house. What he saw there was terrifying. One of the most brutal human butcheries ever committed in New England was how the newspaper described it. The body of David sat on the couch, soaked in blood, which spilled apparently from his head. Carey, terrified, ran to the house next door to get help. When he returned with the neighbors, they found a trail of blood that led to the basement. There they found the body of Sarah. A handprint marred a wooden support beam at the bottom of the stairs. John Carey Jr. was also very helpful when it came to giving the police their biggest lead: his sighting of John Ten Eyck the evening before. The police grabbed hold of that information and ran with it. The newspapers made John Ten Eyck out to be a troublemaker, said he'd been caught stealing some small items and was known to drink his sorrows away with the help of hard cider, but that he'd never been violent. And it's true, Ten Eyck had lived a life of poverty and instability. 46 years before, he'd been born in Lenox to an escaped slave from the state of New York named William Henry Ten Eyck and a woman named Oriella Maria Fletcher. He and his brother, however, were taken in and fostered by a black woman in the New Lenox part of town. Her name was Nancy Kelson, and she'd become quite attached to the two boys while they and their mother stayed with her, their father having left the small family. Their mother, attempting to better herself, and so too the lives of her sons, looked to move away and either find a new husband or new work elsewhere, as was the lot of most single women at the time. Options were slim, even slimmer for a woman of color. But Nancy was worried about a woman and two small sons being able to find work. Many jobs expected women to leave as soon as they had children, and if their poverty were to increase, the small boys might be sent off to jobs of their own, tiny as they were. So their mother agreed to leave her sons with Nancy. She'd always welcome her back, but Oriella must give her word that she'd never take the boys away from Nancy. Nancy had a stable life, and she knew her heart. She'd become too attached and would be torn apart if they left her. So, the arrangement was agreed upon, and Oriella moved away. Nancy Kelson raised them. From then on, she made sure that the boys attended school, and when he was able, young John was keen to work during the off-season. He did all sorts of work for all sorts of people. A long list of local names hired him to work on their farms and estates. As he grew older and stronger, he was able to do heavier work, and his pay increased. He left school at 15, which may seem young, but he actually stayed in school longer than someone of lower working class at the time typically would. He states that he only got into trouble once while at school, when he took the blame for a prank involving a frog that scared his teacher. He did so to protect his friend from punishment. As an adult, he took to drinking, which was introduced to him while he was still young, and working with a woman who was a kitchen maid and would sneak sips of booze from the cellar store of their employer. She shared a little with him, probably in hopes of keeping him quiet about her petty theft of liquor. The habit of drinking he developed led to his inability to save a good sum of money, as he'd often drink his pay away. Though he, for the most part, was paid quite well and worked hard. The only time he admits to breaking the law in his own writings was when he worked for Marshal Hubbard of Pittsfield. Mr. Hubbard put him to work all season, and upon paying him shortchanged his check. Upset by the huge difference in what they'd agreed upon and what was actually given, John Ten Eyck added a number 1 to the beginning of a number 10, thus turning a note for $10 into a note for $110, bringing it back up to the original sum he'd been told he'd receive. He felt justified in the act, and argued that in court when he was caught. But going to the police to argue about a broken promise in payment and taking matters into your own hands are two very different things. So, John was sentenced to 3 years in prison in Lenox. I have an episode on early Berkshire prisons, if you're interested. However, he avoided jail time by paying back the money. Employers failing to pay him what he was promised, or not paying him at all, was an unfortunate theme in his life. Nonetheless, he remained very proud of his work, and honest employers seemed glad to pay him well. At 16, he married 19-year-old Rebecca Robinson from Pittsfield. They had one child, who died from whooping cough, a second, who didn't live very long either. After working a while out of the home, she returned and became pregnant again. But when this third baby was born, as he says, white, John knew the marriage wasn't meant to be, and left her. This third baby died young too. He did spend a little time in jail for stealing a bag of meal. However, Deacon Booth of Hinsdale noticed that the accusation couldn't possibly be true, but Ten Eyck had been drunk the day of his own trial, which might make someone look like a scoundrel. After his release, he moved to Blandford and bought a home there. While he worked in Becket, he had a daughter with a woman he called his wife, though it's not certain if they were officially married. A while later, a son was born to them, and a little later on a daughter, but his wife left him for another man. Still friendly with her parents, they moved into John's house to care for the 2 children. He traveled to Connecticut to do some work there, and while in Cannon, Connecticut, married again. He spent another short while locked up, after a man he was working with lost his temper and whipped someone else. Although his coworker told authorities John wasn't involved, they still convicted John as an accomplice. His life was hard, yes. His life was unfair, yes. but he claimed that he'd never done anything even remotely as bad as murder. So when he was arrested and hauled through a mob, a couple hundred strong, on his way to the jail in Pittsfield, he seemed rather confused. As the throng of people outside cried out for his immediate hanging, for him to be turned over to them for a public lynching, he kept declaring his innocence. Police stopped there. No one else was ever investigated. No other leads were ever followed. They decided that they had found their man, and that he was going to pay. Job, unfortunately, inadequately, sadly, done. David and Sarah Stillman were laid to rest in Sheffield, in Center Cemetery. They share a headstone, which lists both their names, and only one date of death. Ten Eyck was defended by an attorney named Herbert Joyner. It didn't take much for him to see that the evidence was flimsy. The date was the 15th of May, 1878, when the trial began. The scales, used to sell butter, as they were left on the table, were offered as evidence that someone had been there to try to buy butter, and John Carey Jr. claimed that that's what John Ten Eyck had inquired about. Of course, there was the testimony of John Carey Jr., that he'd witnessed him on that road that evening, and that Ten Eyck had asked about the Stillmans. The New York Times of August 17, 1878, said that John Ten Eyck was at the home of William Lyons at the time of his arrest, and that when officers were witnessed coming toward the home, Ten Eyck is reported to have said, "Don't tell these men I am here," to Lyons. It was testified that Mr. Friedland and a Mrs. Orley both gave Ten Eyck matches the day of the killing, and that burnt matches were found at the Stillmans' house. You know, as if every household didn't have matches at that time. One witness introduced was the medical examiner, Dr. Camp of Great Barrington. He'd been called right away when the murder was discovered, and reached the scene at 9 o'clock Friday morning, November 20th. A kerosene lamp was still burning in the house. He noted that the family silver hadn't been touched. He thought the bodies had been dead 15 hours at least. Mr. Stillman had one wound above his right eye, and another over his right temple, the one over the temple being the fatal blow. Camp was also the one who came across a cane left at Johnson's house. The cane is said to have been viewed under a microscope, and blood upon it identified. It was viewed again under an even more powerful microscope at a magnification of 40,000 times, and the blood, he thought, looked human. However, a Dr. F.K. Paddock, having been a doctor for 14 years, was uncertain as to how long the couple had been dead. He claimed it could have been between as little as 2 or 3, or even 8 to 10 hours. He also stated that it was incredibly difficult to tell the difference in human blood from that of animals. The murder weapon itself was found in the front lounge, and it was the Stillmans' own. Though Ten Eyck claimed he'd not been to Sheffield or ever met the Stillmans, a neighbor of the Stillmans, James Rorak, claimed that Mrs. Stillman had hired Ten Eyck to wallpaper their sitting room, that he'd later come back to buy hard cider twice in one day. But this annoyed her, and she told him so. Insulted, Rohrbeck claimed that Mrs. Stillman told him that Ten Eyck had said he would fix them. I'm not sure how I feel about his testimony. They sold the goods from their farm from their home. Was she upset at having a customer? Did she not want to make money? I thought that was the entire point. It also appeared that someone may have been in the attic of the house in an attempt to burn it down. Charred newspaper with the date of November 10th was found stuffed in the rafters. Ten Eyck's own lawyer pointed out how strange it would be if he had tried to start the house on fire, that the house had a good view of the valley and the rest of the village of Sheffield, that this fire would have acted as a beacon and attracted everyone toward it, and that he wouldn't have had time to sufficiently get away. A druggist named Mr. Stone claimed that Ten Eyck came looking for hair dye soon after. A druggist named Mr. Stone claimed that Ten Eyck came looking for hair dye soon after. An interesting event that the same New York Times article mentioned earlier relays is that 7 cents were found in the pocket of Ten Eyck. Ten Eyck claimed that his brother William had sent it to him. They'd not seen each other for 30 years. But John Ten Eyck claimed that his brother, who lived in New Haven, Connecticut, would exchange letters with him, now and then, to catch up. However, this story was dashed when William himself, in a surprise turn of events, took the stand and claimed that he'd not sent any such thing to his brother John, and that he hadn't even known for the last 7 years what town his brother lived in. Not until the news of the murders came out. In another remarkable testimony, a Mr. Francis claimed that John Ten Eyck wished him to deliver a letter to his lawyer, but the young man brought the note to the jailer instead. It seemed to be a forged letter, apparently written by John as if from his brother William, making it seem that William had tried to visit but was turned away, and had also indeed sent him the money. A man named Dwight Boardman testified that John Ten Eyck had borrowed $1 from him the morning of the murders. Not only that, but he knew that John had also fallen from scaffold while working and had suffered slight injuries which resulted in spots of blood on his cane and coat. That was really it. That's all they had. All circumstantial. And even the newspapers admitted that. Nothing that would fly in court today. But at the time, it was enough. Someone had to pay the piper. The trial was practically a farce. Everyone's minds, it seemed, had already been made up. 4 days after it began, after a lot of dramatic speeches about how the murder might have taken place, despite Ten Eyck's saying it didn't, the jury, all white men of course, convicted him in a matter of moments. They did, however, sit around their chamber for a little longer to make it appear as if it wasn't as rushed. Just before the court could hand down the sentencing, John said, "They are the facts, and I have told the jury nothing but the truth in any form. That is all I have to say, sir." John Ten Eyck was sentenced to hang. He spent his last few months at the Berkshire County Jail on 2nd Street in Pittsfield. While there, he tried to leave his mark on the world by writing. A man who felt he'd been given the short end of the stick for his entire life and who was about to die, what he thought was an unjust death, wanted to leave a statement, some sort of evidence that he, despite his short life, had been here and had been so terribly wronged. A few days before his scheduled execution, John Ten Eyck is reported to have admitted to other crimes. Perhaps showing his own faults would earn him a pass. He claimed that he'd burned George Phelps' barn in Colebrook, Connecticut, that he stole from the home of Judge Sedgwick in Norfolk, Connecticut, that he forged the signature of the treasurer of the Clinch Manufacturing Company, Erastus M. Frey, and that he was a bigamist. Maybe he didn't break the law with his second wife. who he may not have actually been married to, but it looks like he did with his third, as he'd never actually bothered to divorce the first. However, he swore over and over that he never was, and wasn't then, a killer of any human being. 3 months and 1 day after his sentencing, on the 16th of August, 1878, John Ten Eyck spent what was said to have been a sleepless night in his cell. Early in the day, he carefully dressed himself as finely as he was able, and at 10:45 he was led outside. The crowd was limited by the sheriff to 250, and there at the 2nd Street Jail, an execution scaffold had been erected. John was stoic in this moment, as he climbed the stairs to the platform, and as he stood where he was directed to, atop the trap door in the floor. He was read his death warrant by the sheriff, and given his last rites by Samuel Harrison, a black minister. When asked if he had anything to say, Ten Eyck did not. A bag was put over his head, and the noose, the drop to the end of the rope, and John Ten Eyck was dead. The New York Times published, Pittsfield, Mass., August 16th. The long career of crime of John Ten Eyck, the colored, incendiary, forger, bigamist, and murderer, came to a close on the scaffold here today. The crime for which he was hanged was the murder, on the evening of the 29th of October last, of Mr. and Mrs. David Stillman, an aged couple residing at Sheffield, one of the southern towns of Berkshire County. That may seem like the end of the story. That should have been the end of the story. However, after the proclamation of death, he was cut down, boxed up, and sent to his family in Blandford. The expectation was that they'd bury him, but his father-in-law had other plans. He hauled John's body to a local train station, where he propped him against a wall, and charged curious passers-by a fee to glance at the real-life body of a murderer. When all was said and done, his take for this disgusting act was a tidy $350. It took the anxious urging of his daughter to convince the man to finally pretend to plant John's body in the ground. Oh, you thought we were done here? John Ten Eyck's father-in-law filled a coffin with stones. The family thought they were burying him when they buried that. Ten Eyck's actual corpse was sold for experimental dissection to a doctor down in Connecticut. Yeah, that's what happened to John Ten Eyck. Was it justified? Was he a killer? Looking back with modern eyes, it seems reasonably doubtful. The fact that police looked at no one else, the fact that John Carey Jr. was the last one to see the couple alive and the first to find them. Carey Jr. seems rather suspicious himself. John Ten Eyck's motive was seen to be robbery for 7 cents. But he left valuables behind? A more personal motive. A deep-seated disdain. John Carey Jr.'s emotional state is not noted at the time, but it would make more sense. An employee with a vendetta, not a thief. A little about John Carey Jr. He was born in Ireland in 1862 and moved to Massachusetts with his parents. After the move, the family had 7 more kids. His father was a farmer, and when he was old enough, he worked as a farmhand. I've done a little digging and haven't found anything that indicated that he was perhaps a violent person. But curious as I am, I can see myself doing more on this. And if I find anything else about Carey Jr. in the future, I'll be sure to edit this episode. If not Carey Jr., then who else? There was a Frenchman who'd traveled around doing odd jobs at about the same time. His name was Charles Wood. He beat a man almost to death in Otis, and succeeded in killing his wife, Hannah Marie Hazard. This murder was also committed with an axe. That's a rundown of what the newspapers had to say, the point of view of the judge and jury, and the execution itself. But how would you like to know what John Ten Eyck had to say in his very own words? My plan for next episode is to read the short book he wrote while in prison, to share with you what he had to say about his own life. So this, in fact, is a part 1, and in a short time I will post a part 2. I hope you'll listen to that as well, and then maybe you can make up your own mind as to who murdered David and Sarah Stillman. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where I post pictures pertaining to Berkshire history. You can also find more episodes on Facebook or every episode we've ever made by visiting www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. Each episode posted is also accompanied by specific imagery pertaining to that topic. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.